Hey guys, tonight we will step into a story so strange that if it had not been recorded in history, people might believe it was only a legend. The story of Anne Boleyn, a woman who was not a breathtaking beauty, not a princess, not the treasured jewel of any kingdom. Yet she made a king change the law, tear apart centuries-old traditions, and burn down an entire religious empire just to have her. And then that very same king, Henry VIII, lifted Anne to the highest place any woman in the 16th century could ever reach, before pushing her off the cliff with his own hands, in a plan so swift that even Anne's enemies were stunned by how quickly it unfolded. In the shadows of the court, there were men rewriting each story, adjusting every rumor, turning the smallest breath into evidence. They watched every glance Anne gave, every smile, every whisper, as if they already knew that a single misplaced detail would be enough to finish a queen. And in the midst of all that, between the obsession, the betrayal, the panic, the staged trials, and the long nights inside the Tower of London, a small child, Elizabeth, was growing up. None of them knew that this child would become one of the greatest rulers in the history of humankind, and the final answer to her mother's entire tragedy. A story filled with lingering questions. Was Anne truly the victim of a conspiracy? Or was she the only woman brave enough to play a game that everyone else feared to touch? And why were those closest to Henry so eager to accelerate her downfall? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And before we sink into the mist of this story, leave a comment and tell me which state you are watching from, and what time it is where you are right now. There is always something beautiful about knowing that someone in Texas, New Jersey, or Oregon is slowly closing their eyes in the middle of the night, listening to a tale that fell silent 500 years ago. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Anne Boleyn was born at the beginning of the 16th century into a rising noble family woven from the threads of the Boleyns, the Howards, and the Ormond line. She was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, a sharp-minded diplomat who held the titles Earl of Ormond and Earl of Wiltshire, and her mother was Elizabeth Howard, daughter of Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. Although the exact year of Anne's birth has always been debated, somewhere around 1500 or 1507, what is certain is that she grew up in comfort, with an education far more advanced than what most young noblewomen of her age would ever receive. She had two siblings, Mary, the eldest, Anne, the second child, and George, the youngest. From her earliest years, Anne was trained with care and intention. She learned to read, to write, to spell. She studied arithmetic, history, and the foundations of religious teaching. Alongside these academic lessons, she absorbed the arts expected of a noble young woman. Music with its delicate phrasing, dancing with its poised rhythms, embroidery with its patience and precision, and the intricate codes of etiquette that governed every gesture in aristocratic life. She was taught how to manage a household, how to speak with grace, how to carry herself with quiet authority. But the most important part of her education was waiting for her far from home. In the year 1512, Thomas Boleyn was appointed ambassador to the court of Margaret of Austria, one of the most refined and intellectually vibrant courts in all of Europe. It was a world of scholars, diplomats, poets, and reform-minded thinkers. Thomas Boleyn managed to impress Margaret enough to secure a place for his daughter in her household, an opportunity beyond measure for a girl in her early teens. Anne arrived the following year, stepping into a new world that would shape her more deeply than anyone could have predicted. Margaret herself wrote that Anne was intelligent and pleasant beyond what might be expected for her young age, a rare compliment from a woman known for her high standards. In the year 1513, Anne left Margaret's court to accompany Mary Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII, to France. Mary Tudor had just married the elderly French king, Louis XII, and Anne followed as part of her household. When the king died only a few months later, and Mary Tudor returned to England, Anne did not go with her. Instead, she transferred into the service of Queen Claude, wife of King Francis I. This decision, whether made for her or by her, proved transformative. Anne spent 6 years in France, and those 6 years shaped nearly every detail of who she became. France taught her fluency in its language, elegance in its fashion, refinement in its music, and a level of courtly sophistication unmatched in England. She learned the subtleties of flirtation and the polished dance of courtly love, an art that combined wit, restraint, intellect, and charm. She learned how to carry herself with confidence, how to speak with brightness and precision, how to move through a room with a presence that people noticed even before they realized they were looking at her. It was in France that she developed the blend of intelligence and allure that later captivated courtiers and eventually a king. By the time she returned to England in the year 1521, Anne was 21 years old, sharp, composed, fluent in French, and effortlessly refined. She was no longer simply Thomas Boleyn's daughter. She was a product of the most illustrious courts of Europe, a young woman whose education and worldliness set her apart from nearly every other lady in England. Courtiers described her as stylish, graceful, and captivating, not merely beautiful in the traditional sense, but possessing a presence that drew eyes and held them. She returned not as a quiet, noble girl, but as something far more intriguing, a gift imported from France, polished by foreign courts, shaped by European sophistication, and carrying within her the confidence of someone who already understood that the world was much larger than England, and that she was ready, at last, to step into it. When Anne returned home to England, her family immediately began seeking a marriage worthy of her. She was, by every measure, an exceptional candidate for any political alliance. Her education was rare, her refinement unmistakable, her family rising in influence, and her experience in European courts giving her a sophistication few English women possessed. Thomas Howard, her uncle, once considered marrying her to James Butler in hopes of resolving the territorial dispute over Ormond between the Boleyns and the Butlers. But the arrangement collapsed quietly, leaving Anne unattached yet increasingly admired. Suitors appeared almost as soon as she re-entered court life. Anne did not return as a sheltered young woman, but as someone transformed by France, carrying with her a foreign elegance, a poised confidence, and a presence English courtiers were not accustomed to. Her name became widely spoken after the Chateau Vert pageant in the year 1522, where she performed dressed in white, embroidered with gold. Her manner, her grace, and her French-inflected charm drew many curious eyes. Anne's presence was not loud, yet it was impossible to ignore. Among the first men to fall deeply in love with her was Henry Percy, heir to the Earl of Northumberland. Their affection grew quietly until it deepened into a secret betrothal. For a brief moment, Anne seemed on the path to a future shaped by sincere emotion rather than calculation. But Percy's father objected fiercely, and Cardinal Wolsey, accustomed to shaping the fate of nobles, intervened and ended the engagement. It was Anne's first intimate encounter with the harsh truth that personal happiness could be erased instantly by political will. The pain of that loss hardened something inside her, forming a quiet resilience that would define her adulthood. Gossip later suggested that Anne harbored feelings for the poet Thomas Wyatt, a married man known for his lyrical admiration of her. Yet most scholars agree that whatever passed between them belonged to the symbolic realm of courtly love, where admiration existed without the expectation of consummation. What mattered for Anne's future was not Wyatt's sighs, nor Percy's broken promise, nor the lingering whispers that drifted behind her. What truly mattered was the year 1526, when Henry VIII at last took notice of her. At first, Henry saw in Anne a familiar pattern. Her sister, Mary Boleyn, had once been his mistress, and Henry assumed Anne would fall into the same role as easily as any woman before her. But Anne refused every advance that might place her among the long list of royal diversions. She declined gifts, avoided compromising encounters, and maintained a poised distance that both respected the king and denied him. It was not coldness, it was resolve. She would not be a mistress. If Henry wanted her, he would have to approach her differently. This resistance, subtle yet unwavering, only intensified Henry's fascination. A king accustomed to immediate obedience suddenly found himself facing a woman who did not bend. The more Anne withdrew, the more determined Henry became. His desire grew into something deeper, not the pursuit of a lover, but the longing for a partner he could elevate, claim, and transform into a central figure of his future. Between the years 1527 and 1528, Henry, the same king who disliked writing and rarely expressed himself on paper, penned 17 love letters to Anne. Their survival is remarkable, for they reveal a side of Henry seldom seen: vulnerable, earnest, restless, and softened by longing. He wrote of sleepless nights, of impatience, of her absence weighing on him more heavily than he expected. Anne, by refusing him gently yet firmly, had drawn from the king a devotion that surprised even him. Those letters mark the beginning of a transformation greater than either of them could have imagined. A path had opened, one that led not only to Anne's future, but to England's. Her insistence on dignity forced Henry to imagine her not as a mistress, but as a wife. To reach her, he would have to reshape his world. His marriage, his loyalties, the laws of his kingdom, and the ancient relationship between crown and church would all be called into question. This was the beginning. A moment small enough to almost go unnoticed, an heir's rejected proposal, a broken engagement, a king's unexpected infatuation. Yet from these quiet beginnings would rise a storm powerful enough to unsettle a nation and alter the course of England forever. By the time Anne stepped fully into the circle of royal attention, Henry VIII was 35 years old. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had cooled into a polite, dutiful companionship that left him restless, frustrated, and without a male heir. Only a daughter, Mary, had survived infancy, and as the years passed, Henry convinced himself that his misfortune was divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow. In his mind, this violation of sacred law explained every failed pregnancy, every disappointment, every empty cradle. He wanted the marriage annulled, but Catherine refused. She would not bend, not even for a king, and it was into this fracture, this widening crack in the Tudor world, that Anne stepped. Anne understood the landscape better than anyone expected. She knew how fragile the king's pride was, how deep his longing for a son ran, how strongly he yearned for both affection and validation. But she also understood the danger of becoming merely a mistress. Her sister, Mary Boleyn, had been one, and what had it gained her? Nothing lasting, nothing dignified. Anne wanted more. She wanted the crown, the legitimacy, and the power to shape the world around her. And so she held him close, close enough that he could not look away, yet always just beyond reach. She captivated him, fascinated him, maddened him, and refused him. She would not sleep with Henry. That line remained untouched. If he wanted her, he would have to claim her as his lawful wife. While Cardinal Wolsey fought to convince the Pope to dissolve Henry's marriage, Anne quietly assumed the role of a queen in waiting. Step by step, degree by degree, she moved deeper into the machinery of power. She accepted petitions, granted small favours, and cultivated alliances. Courtiers seeking the king's attention increasingly approached Anne instead. Her influence grew, not loudly, but steadily, like candlelight spreading across a dim room. Even those who disliked her had to acknowledge her presence. She was no longer simply a lady of the court. She had become a gravitational force. But Rome would not yield. The Pope, imprisoned by forces loyal to Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, could not risk offending the most powerful ruler in Europe, and so he delayed, postponed, reconsidered, stalled, and ultimately refused. Every door Wolsey knocked upon closed. Every letter sent to Rome returned with disappointment. Anne's patience thinned. She began supporting factions that opposed Wolsey, men who had been waiting for years to unseat the cardinal who towered too high above them. In the year 1529, Wolsey fell from power. For Anne, it was a victory, a quiet but undeniable one. She had helped topple one of the strongest men in England, and yet the question of the king's marriage remained painfully unresolved. During this time, Anne placed into Henry's hands a small book that would alter the course of English history, The Obedience of a Christian Man by William Tyndale. Within its pages was an idea so bold, so electrically charged, that once Henry read it, he could not let it go. The book argued that a king, not the Pope, was the true head of the Church in his own realm. Anne understood exactly what she was doing. Henry, who had once been named Defender of the Faith for opposing Protestant ideas, now found himself drawn to a doctrine that placed ultimate power in his hands. No Pope, no foreign authority, no need to beg Rome for permission. The book offered him a vision of kingship, unshackled from tradition. Anne was no longer simply the cause of a royal annulment. She had become the catalyst for a transformation that reached far beyond marriage, far into the soul of the nation. With each passing month, Henry's frustration with Rome deepened. What had begun as the king's great matter, a personal plea to free himself from a marriage he believed cursed, slowly evolved into something more monumental, a break with the authority of the Pope. Anne stood at the center of that shift. Her refusal to yield made Henry question why he should ever yield to Rome. Her ambition made him imagine a future where he answered to no one but himself. Her presence made him believe he could reshape England, reshape the church, reshape destiny itself. What began as a private dilemma between husband and wife now swelled into a national crisis. A king demanding freedom, a queen refusing to disappear, a pope unable to move, an empire watching, and Anne, calm, poised, unflinching, holding her position just beyond the king's reach. This was the moment when the story changed shape. The king's personal struggle became the country's spiritual war. The search for an annulment became the spark of a new religious order. And Anne Boleyn, quiet, deliberate, determined, became the unseen architect behind a question that would echo across centuries. Who truly ruled England, the throne or Rome? In the year 1532, Anne was past 30, and Henry had been pursuing her for nearly 6 long years. Those years were full of letters, longing, frustration, and the slow tightening of a bond that neither of them could fully step away from. By the end of that year, the royal journey to Calais became the quiet turning point in a story that had stretched far beyond courtly flirtation. Surrounded by diplomats, distant from Catherine's influence, and carried by the momentum of Henry's determination, Anne finally allowed the king to draw close to her. After years of restraint, she let the barrier fall. Perhaps she understood, with a clarity sharpened by time, that if she conceived a child, especially a son, Henry would be forced to act, not only as a lover, but as a king. And before winter settled over England, she became pregnant. From that moment, everything moved with a speed that had been impossible before. On the 14th day of November, Anne and Henry were married in a quiet, hidden ceremony. There were no crowds, no trumpets, no public vows, only a private exchange meant to secure the legitimacy of the child Anne carried. But secrecy could not hold forever. On the 25th day of January, in the year 1533, they married again, this time openly. The courtiers who witnessed it may not have known how deeply the kingdom was about to change, but the tremor was already spreading. In May, the long struggle between the English crown and Rome reached its deciding moment. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine void, legally invalid from the beginning. It was a spiritual and political earthquake. The Pope, furious and unwilling to bend to Henry's will, excommunicated the king. But Henry stood unmoved. His new marriage, his new queen, and his future heir mattered more than the approval of Rome. And Anne, visibly pregnant and already stepping into her royal role, became the living symbol of England's defiance. On the first day of June came the triumph, Anne's coronation. It was one of the most extravagant ceremonies of the entire Tudor age. The city was decorated, musicians filled the air with sound, and crowds lined the streets to watch the new queen pass beneath a canopy of cloth of gold. Anne, radiant and expectant, seemed destined to deliver the son England had been waiting for. Her confidence showed in every step. Most astonishing of all, she was crowned not with a queen consort's coronet, but with the crown of St. Edward, the sacred crown reserved for monarchs themselves. It was a statement painted in gold. Henry believed the child inside her would be a king. But on the 7th day of September, in the year 1533, hope shifted course. In the quiet chambers of Greenwich Palace, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The child was healthy, alert, and strong, yet she was not the longed-for prince. The disappointment was immediate, though not overwhelming. Henry, to Anne's relief, loved his daughter deeply. He lifted the baby in his arms with pride, and Anne placed her hope in the future, certain she would soon conceive again. Life in the royal household changed quickly. Anne embraced her new role with the grandeur expected of a Tudor queen. Her household swelled to a lavish scale, 60 ladies in waiting, attended by nearly 250 servants. Her dresses shimmered with silk and jewels, her chambers overflowed with luxury, and her presence at court shone with commanding brilliance. To her enemies, this was proof of extravagance. To those loyal to her, it was the rightful splendor of a crowned queen, one who had waited years to stand beneath the Tudor sun. Yet beneath the silken ceremony, tension thickened. Anne knew she must give Henry a son. Without one, she stood on unsteady ground. The old loyalties of the court still leaned toward Catherine. The people still murmured against her. She needed the protection that only a male heir could provide. In the year 1534, she became pregnant again. For months, she guarded her health, her steps, her meals, her peace. But fate, unkind and relentless, intervened. She miscarried. The loss struck like a silent blow. Henry's disappointment, heavy and visible, settled between them like a veil. His once fiery devotion cooled into something uncertain. His patience, which had carried him through years of waiting, began to fade, and Anne felt the shift, instantly felt it in the way he spoke to her, in the way he lingered less, in the way his gaze slid past her toward easier comforts. She understood, in a way that chilled her to the bone. Without a son, the crown she wore was not a foundation. It was a fragile, cracking shell, and beneath it, everything she had fought for was beginning to tremble. From the year 1534 to the year 1536, Anne found herself surrounded by enemies, some loud, some silent, some hidden in plain sight. The first was Mary, the daughter of Henry and Catherine, a girl whose world had been torn apart by Anne's rise. The second was the English people, who still held deep affection for Catherine and saw Anne as the cause of their beloved queen's suffering. The third was the nobility opposed to religious reform men who despised the changes unfolding around them. And finally, the fourth, soft-footed and dangerous in her quietness, Jane Seymour, the new presence shimmering in the king's gaze. Anne tried to mend her relationship with Mary. She approached her, attempted kindness, attempted reconciliation, but Mary refused every gesture. She called Anne that woman, clinging to her loyalty to her mother with a fierce, wounded pride. To Mary, Anne was not simply a rival, she was the reason Catherine had been cast aside, the reason Mary had been declared illegitimate, the reason the world she knew had collapsed. Nothing Anne said could soften that. And behind Mary's anger was a deeper fear that gnawed at Anne, the lingering shadow of Catherine herself. Even after being banished from court, Catherine still held a place in Henry's memory. Anne's fears sharpened when she learned that Henry, even after all the battles fought to remove Catherine, had asked her to stitch shirts for him. Anne's jealousy flared with quiet desperation. How could she stand firm as queen if the king still reached back toward the woman he had cast off? Beyond these personal wounds, the wider world was turning against Anne with growing force. Catholic factions across England saw her as the root of every fracture in the realm. They blamed her for the break with Rome. They whispered that she had bewitched the king. They said she had led him into heresy. They tied her name to every misfortune: the execution of Sir Thomas More, the dissolution of monasteries, the death of Catherine. To them, Anne was not merely a queen, they painted her as the architect of England's moral decline. Yet Anne's heart, in truth, leaned earnestly toward reform. She wanted the wealth of dissolved monasteries to be used for schools, for learning, for the poor. She imagined hospitals, colleges, charity foundations, places where the suffering of ordinary people could be eased. But Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, had other ambitions. He envisioned wealth flowing into the royal treasury, power concentrating around the crown, and the political balance tilting toward those he favored. Their visions collided sharply, and what had once been partnership became hostility. As Cromwell moved his pieces, Anne began to realize how precarious her position truly was. Then came January of the year 1536. Henry suffered a terrible fall while jousting, thrown violently from his horse, left unconscious, surrounded by panic. For hours, no one knew if the king would live. For Anne, already pregnant again, the shock was unbearable. Fear wrapped itself around her like ice, and in that fear, she miscarried. The child was a boy. The imperial ambassador, Chapuis, wrote with cold precision, "She has miscarried of her saviour." Those words echoed through the court like a funeral bell. Anne knew what they meant. A son could have secured her future, steadied her crown, softened Henry's wandering gaze. Without him, everything was shifting. Henry, shaken by the accident and devastated by the loss of a male heir, looked at Anne with new eyes. Not with love, not with anger, but with something heavier: superstition. He began muttering that Anne was cursed, that she was bad luck, that God refused him sons through her. Her quick mind, once irresistible, now irritated him. Her strong opinions, once intoxicating, now wearied him. Every argument, every tear, every plea widened the gulf between them. And into that widening space stepped Jane Seymour. She was the opposite of Anne in almost every way: gentle, soft-spoken, compliant. She did not debate. She did not challenge. She lowered her eyes when Henry spoke. She folded her hands demurely when he approached. She was the image of obedience, crafted into the shape Henry now longed for. The contrast was cruel. and it was deliberate. Anne felt the shift as clearly as one feels the cold wind at the edge of a cliff. She saw how Henry's gaze lingered on Jane, how the courtiers began circling around the Seymours, how Cromwell watched it all with a calculating calm that chilled her more deeply than any winter air could. She understood the truth now, with painful clarity. She was standing at the edge of a precipice, and the ground beneath her was beginning to crumble. Step by step, day by day, the world she had fought so hard to build was slipping away from her grasp. After the miscarriage of her son, in the early months of the year 1536, Anne's position began to crumble beneath her feet. The court felt the shift like a change in the weather. Henry, shaken by the loss, began whispering that he had made the wrong choice again. And those who already despised Anne sensed opportunity. They tasted danger in the air, not for themselves, but for her. And among them, the most lethal presence was Thomas Cromwell. Once his closest political partner, Anne now saw him turning into an enemy whose patience, precision, and cold ambition made him far more frightening than any outspoken critic. The conflict between Anne and Cromwell was not rooted in wounded pride or passing irritation. It was a clash of visions, two blueprints for England's future, both born from the break with Rome. Anne believed the kingdom's new wealth, especially the riches taken from dissolved monasteries, should flow back to the people, to schools, to relief for the poor, to opportunities for work and learning. She imagined an England where reform meant renewal. Cromwell, however, wished to funnel that fortune into the royal treasury, strengthening the crown and, by extension, his own power. Their disagreement sharpened each month until it felt like steel drawn against steel. There was more. Anne leaned firmly toward France, favoring alliances that reflected her upbringing and the culture that had shaped her mind. Cromwell preferred an accord with the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, a direction he considered safer and more profitable for the shifting political landscape. The two had once stood shoulder to shoulder in bringing down Cardinal Wolsey. Now, they faced each other across an invisible battlefield, and the king, fickle, weary, hungry for stability, stood in the middle, waiting for someone to offer him a clean escape. At the same time, another figure began gliding into Henry's life with quiet, calculated gentleness, Jane Seymour. She came from a respectable but not overly powerful family, the sort of lineage that posed no threat, no ambition beyond modest hope. Her nature seemed soft, her manner humble, her voice mild. She did not argue. She did not question. She kept her eyes lowered and her words measured, reflecting exactly the opposite of Anne's fiery intelligence and strong-willed nature. A story, half legend and half whisper, later circulated through the court. One day, Henry presented Jane with a small locket containing his own portrait. She toyed with it playfully, opening and closing it as she sat in Anne's presence. When Anne saw the miniature, her temper snapped. She ripped the locket from Jane's neck with such force that she drew blood. Whether the tale is embroidered or not, its survival reveals the truth beneath it. Anne felt the threat walking beside her, breathing the same air, moving silently into the king's thoughts. Cromwell noticed it too, and in Jane he found the final piece he needed. If Henry wished to replace his queen yet again, Cromwell could be the architect of that transition, removing a troublesome queen and securing his dominance in the newly reordered court. For Cromwell, supporting the king's shifting affection was not an act of loyalty, but a calculation. Anne was becoming an obstacle. If she could be removed cleanly, Cromwell's vision for England would move forward without resistance, and so he began assembling the machinery of destruction. It did not happen in a rush. It unfolded quietly, almost gently, like frost forming overnight on a window. Cromwell started noting names, movements, conversations, anything that could later be twisted into accusation. Men who had been near Anne, spoken to her, laughed with her, served her, each one quietly added to a mental ledger. None of them knew what they were walking into. None imagined the king's anger would soon reach across their lives as well. Meanwhile, the court still glittered on the surface. Feasts continued, processions marched, masses were sung. But underneath the music and ceremony, something cold was forming. A plan was taking shape in shadows that Anne could not yet fully see. She sensed danger, but she did not know its size. She felt the air tightening, but she could not yet trace the threads being woven around her. Cromwell's strategy deepened with each passing week. Henry grew more distant. Jane Seymour appeared more often at the edges of the king's vision. Courtiers shifted their loyalties like birds turning before a coming storm. And at the centre, Anne stood alone, balancing pride, fear, and the shrinking hope that she could still produce a son. The court watched her with the quiet fascination of witnesses who know a fall is coming, even before the one who is falling knows it herself. Everything continued outwardly the same. And yet, behind the curtains and beneath the rituals, a trap was already tightening its circle around the Queen. By the end of April, in the year 1536, Cromwell finally moved. Quietly, methodically, he set the first piece of his design into motion. The opening strike fell upon Mark Smeaton, a court musician, often near Anne, friendly with her, yet belonging to the lowest social rung among those in the Queen's circle. His position made him the perfect target. Too insignificant to be protected, too vulnerable to resist, too powerless to cry for help. Smeaton was seized and questioned with an urgency that made the walls of the court tremble with rumour. Whether he was tortured or merely threatened with the kind of fear that crushes the spirit, no one can say with certainty. What is nearly certain is that the pressure broke him. At last, he confessed that he had been the Queen's lover. It was a confession impossible to believe. The social gulf between a queen and a musician was too vast to cross unnoticed. Yet this single, fragile admission became the cornerstone of Cromwell's case, the first brick laid in the structure of treason he was constructing. From there, the web spread outward. Next came Henry Norris, groom of the stool, the king's closest attendant, confidant, and one of the few men truly trusted by Henry. Norris had long supported Anne, and his loyalty made him dangerous to Cromwell's plan. Fate or Cromwell's manipulation placed him in Anne's path during a tense encounter. Anne, already anxious and fraying under pressure, made an unwise remark, something that could be interpreted as, "If the king were to die." It was an offhand comment, born from frustration, not malice, but in Cromwell's hands it became a weapon. Norris was arrested swiftly. During interrogation, he refused to confess, even when he was subtly promised mercy. If he admitted guilt, his life would be spared. His refusal was steadfast, the act of a man who believed truth could still protect him. But truth, in that moment, no longer lived in the Tudor court. It had already been pushed out by fear, ambition, and the king's silent hunger for release. Then came the others. Francis Weston, William Brereton, Richard Page, and the poet Thomas Wyatt. Each name plucked like a piece from a chessboard. Each man connected to Anne only loosely, through a glance, a joke, a rumour, or a whisper overheard by the wrong ears. Their arrests created ripples of shock. They were known, respected, and in many cases admired. Yet all were swept into Cromwell's widening net, accused not because they were guilty, but because they were useful. Finally came the most devastating accusation of all. George Boleyn, Anne's brother. Cromwell charged him, not only with adultery involving the Queen, but with incest. The accusation struck England like a thunderclap. It was monstrous, unthinkable, a crime so grotesque that even those who disliked Anne recoiled at the idea. But Cromwell understood exactly what he was doing. By accusing brother and sister together, he ensured maximum revulsion, maximum scandal, and maximum political force. The more shocking the charge, the easier it would be to crush the Queen beneath it. Behind the scenes, the legal machinery clicked into place with chilling ease. Cromwell resurrected a statute from the reign of Edward III, a law declaring that if a queen committed adultery, any children she bore could be considered illegitimate, posing a danger to the stability of the royal succession. Under this law, adultery was not merely sin, it was treason, and treason meant death. With this technicality, Cromwell elevated the accusations from moral failing to national threat. The grand juries of Middlesex and Kent convened quickly. They did not sift evidence, for there was little to sift. Instead, they listened, nodded, and delivered the verdicts expected of them. They were not ignorant men. They understood perfectly what was being asked of them. To contradict Cromwell and the king was to risk their own futures, perhaps even their own lives. So they did what frightened men have always done. They obeyed. Piece by piece, the tapestry was woven threads of hearsay, strands of forced confessions, flashes of rumour, fragments of misunderstanding, all stitched together into a single dark image. Anne Boleyn, the adulterous queen, conspiring to overthrow the king. It did not matter that the picture was false. It mattered only that it looked convincing from a distance. Through April and into early May, the accusations thickened, hardening like ice on a winter lake. Smeaton's broken confession, Norris's refusal to yield, Wyatt's poetry, Weston's charm, Brereton's influence, Page's familiarity, George's brilliance, every trait that had once defined these men now became shadows against them. Anne, alone in her royal chambers, sensed that the air around her had changed. The court moved differently. Conversations quieted when she approached. Eyes slid away too quickly. Doors closed too softly. A storm was gathering, vast and cold, and the Queen, still unaware of its full shape, stood at its centre, already surrounded by the first falling snow. On the 2nd day of May, in the year 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The journey began with a small boat gliding along the Thames, its silence broken only by the soft sound of oars. As she stepped out, fear overtook her poise, and she cried out for news of her father and of her dear sweet brother, clinging to the fragile hope that they were safe. But within hours, that hope shattered. George Boleyn, brilliant, loyal, utterly unprepared for the cruelty awaiting him, was thrown into the same grim fortress. Brother and sister, once at the pinnacle of royal favour, were now prisoners awaiting judgment. The trials began swiftly. On the 12th day of May, the accused gentlemen, Smeaton, Norris, Weston, Brereton, were brought before the court. Each man faced charges of treason, painted in sharp, exaggerated strokes by Cromwell's steady hand. The verdicts were predetermined. Every one of them was declared guilty. Their fates, tied like knots, sealed the path toward Anne's own doom. With the men condemned, the stage was set. If they were guilty, then Anne, accused of conspiring with them, must be guilty as well. The narrative had been written, and now it only awaited its final actors. On the 15th day of May, within the Tower itself, Anne and George were brought forward for their own trial. The great hall filled with 27 noblemen, lords who owed Cromwell favours, lords who feared contradicting the king, lords who understood that Anne's fall would clear the path for their own ambitions. Their faces were composed, unreadable, as if they were watching a play whose ending had already been announced. Before them stood a queen stripped of her power but not her dignity. Anne's voice, steady and soft, floated through the chamber. She answered every question clearly, carefully, refusing to break even as accusations piled upon her like stones. She denied each charge, refused every insinuation. Though she knew the verdict had already been written, she still fought to preserve the last piece of herself that could not be taken, her dignity. She had been England's queen. Now she would meet judgment with the calm she had cultivated through years of courtly discipline. George's ordeal was harsher. The accusations against him were grotesque, centered on charges of incest, built from fragments of overheard remarks, twisted words, and scraps of gossip stitched together into something monstrous. He defended himself brilliantly, exposing contradictions, highlighting absurdity, pressing logic where none was welcome. His intelligence was sharp enough to unsettle the men judging him, but intelligence could not save him. The verdict, like Anne's, had been decided long before he spoke a word. Only 2 days later, on the 17th day of May, Thomas Cranmer delivered a ruling that made the entire process feel like a cruel joke. He declared the marriage between Henry and Anne null and void, invalid from the beginning. In the eyes of the law, according to this sudden pronouncement, they had never been husband and wife at all. And if they had never been married, how could Anne be guilty of adultery? The contradiction hung in the air like a bitter scent. But logic no longer held meaning in Henry's court. What mattered was expedience. What mattered was clearing the path for Jane Seymour. Henry needed a lawful justification to remove his wife. Cromwell provided it, Cranmer blessed it, and the machinery of the state carried it forward with unfeeling precision. That same day, the condemned men were executed. Mark Smeaton, whose broken confession had started it all, suffered the full traitor's death, hanged, and then disemboweled. The others, Norris, Weston, Brereton, received what was called mercy, the swiftness of the axe. Their blood darkened the soil of the Tower grounds before the sun had reached its height. Anne remained alive, held in her chambers like a figure trapped between two worlds not yet gone, no longer living in her own life. 2 more days passed as she waited. She prayed. She spoke softly with the women who remained with her. She tried to make peace with the truth that her daughter would grow up without her, that her name would be dragged through mud, that her story would be rewritten by those who wanted it extinguished. On the 18th day, she learned that her execution was set for the morrow. She thanked the constable for telling her gently. She asked for prayers. She folded her hands and breathed carefully. The court moved on, already preparing for the rise of Jane Seymour. But in the stillness of her final night, Anne Boleyn, once the woman who shaped a king, once the force that reshaped a nation, waited alone, listening to the quiet echo of footsteps along the cold stone of the tower, knowing dawn would bring the end. In the final days of her captivity in the tower, Anne's emotions drifted in fragile, wavering currents, passing from panic to exhaustion, then settling for moments at a strange and trembling calm. William Kingston, the lieutenant of the tower, recorded her behavior with sympathetic unease. She spoke quickly, circling from one thought to another, and she laughed, he wrote, much and inopportunely, as though clinging to laughter the way someone clings to a small piece of wood in deep water. It was the laughter of a woman determined not to drown in fear. On the morning of the 19th day of May, Anne sent for Kingston. When he came, she quietly confessed that she had believed she would die earlier in the day. "To be past my pain," she said. Then, half joking and half resigned, she remarked that she had a little neck, and that she had heard the French executioner was very good. Beneath her light tone lay a woman hollowed by dread, yet still trying to hold the last pieces of dignity in her trembling hands. Henry, in what he called mercy, had changed her sentence from burning to beheading and summoned a swordsman from France, skilled with a long, sharp blade. It was meant to be swift and nearly painless, but it was not kindness. It was arrangement, order, a controlled ending to a story he wished to erase smoothly from his path. Near noon, Anne dressed with deliberate care. She wore a dark grey gown trimmed with fur, and beneath it a crimson underdress the colour of martyrdom. Her hair was tucked away beneath a hood, her face pale but thoughtful. Two ladies followed her as she walked toward the wooden scaffold on the north side of the White Tower. The sky was muted above her, the air unsettlingly still. Witnesses later said she did not appear frantic or broken. Instead, she carried a calm so unusual and steady that it unsettled even those long opposed to her. Perhaps it was the calm of someone who had finally reached the farthest edge of fear. On the platform, Anne faced the small crowd. She did not accuse Henry. She did not proclaim innocence. She did not plead for mercy. Such words were forbidden. Instead, she spoke softly, steadily, using the ritual phrases expected of a condemned queen. She asked the people to pray for her. She prayed for the king, calling him a gentle and merciful prince. Everyone knew these were required words, yet her tone, quiet, controlled, strangely peaceful, moved many to tears. Her last words were simple. "Into God's hands I commit my soul." Then she knelt, her hands folded in prayer. A blindfold was tied over her eyes. The French executioner waited behind her with his sword hidden under straw so she would not see it. He moved quietly, without shoes, so she would not hear him. Then he spoke softly to his assistant. Anne instinctively turned her head toward the sound. In that small, final motion, her life reached its end. One clean strike. A single flash, and Anne Boleyn fell. The blow was so swift that many watching did not realize it was over until her body slumped forward. One lady rushed to cover the severed head with a white cloth. Another knelt beside the fallen body. There was no royal trumpet, no procession, no blessing, only a heavy silence. Her body and head were carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula and buried without a marker, without inscription, without ceremony. No stone bore her name. No anthem was sung. Her grave lay beneath cold floor tiles, hidden from sight. The woman who had once changed the fate of England was laid to rest in anonymity, in quiet stone, far from the splendour she had once worn. The court moved on, the city exhaled, and the silence that followed her death settled over the tower like a final curtain, soft and heavy, ending the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn. The morning after Anne's execution, before her ladies had even finished weeping in the tower, Henry VIII became engaged to Jane Seymour. Not days later, not weeks the very next day. It was as if a door had closed with the fall of the sword, and another had been opened before the echo faded. Court chroniclers recorded the moment with cold precision. The king, newly freed, moved directly toward a future he had already arranged long before Anne's final breath. Within only a few days, he married Jane, and the Seymour family rose like a tide, lifted by the king's sudden and overwhelming favour. Titles, lands, and influence flowed to them with a swiftness that left the court breathless. For the Boleyns, the opposite fate unfolded. Their name dimmed almost overnight. George was gone, Anne was gone, and the surviving members of the family retreated into the background of political life. No one wished to be associated with a queen who had fallen so completely, and Henry, determined to cleanse his reign of what he now considered a mistake, began the slow erasure of Anne from the official record of memory. Portraits were removed. Initials were scraped away from stone and wood. The intertwined H and A that had once decorated palaces were hacked out or replaced. Anne became a shadow, a cautionary tale whispered only when necessary and never kindly. During the remaining years of Henry's reign, her name hovered at the edges of conversation, spoken rarely and only with care. Those who had once admired her intelligence, her wit, her sharp political sense, now avoided any suggestion that they had ever supported her. Henry's court functioned like a hive that instantly rejected anything associated with a queen who had fallen from favour. Silence settled over her memory, heavy and deliberate. When Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, eventually rose to the throne, the silence turned to condemnation. In Mary's reign, Anne was recast as a destroyer of families, a seductress, a witch whose ambition had led England astray. She became a symbol of everything wrong with leaving the Catholic Church, a figure invoked to warn of the dangers of pride, heresy, and disobedience. Under Mary, Anne's name was not merely forgotten, it was publicly scorned. It was only when Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, ascended the throne that the memory of the executed queen shifted again. Elizabeth could not openly honour a mother condemned for treason. She could not erect monuments or demand the rewriting of trials. But quietly, subtly, she allowed Anne's image to be restored in small ways. Under her reign, Anne transformed from a woman hated by many into a kind of Protestant martyr, a misunderstood queen whose life had been stolen by politics and fear. Some called her a victim of injustice. Some called her a brave supporter of religious reform. Most simply accepted that her story, like so many stories from that turbulent age, refused to settle into clear moral categories. For even among those sympathetic to Anne, the shadows remained. Her involvement in the downfall of Catherine of Aragon could not be ignored, nor could her coldness toward Mary, or the sharp edges of her ambition. She had played the game of power with a fierceness that sometimes slid toward cruelty. But those who disliked her were forced to admit another truth. Anne possessed unmistakable intelligence, deep personal faith, and a genuine interest in education and charity. She imagined uses for the wealth of dissolved monasteries that went beyond royal coffers, schools, relief for the poor, a more humane and thoughtful England. Her aspirations were larger than her era allowed. Her story cannot be reduced to a simple tale of virtue or vice. She was not merely the other woman who stepped between a king and his first wife. Nor was she the monstrous figure her enemies painted, nor was she the flawless victim some later Protestants tried to sanctify. She was a woman complex, passionate, flawed, brilliant, frightened, trying to carve a place for herself in a world built to deny her that place. If there is one truth nearly all modern historians agree upon, it is this: she did not deserve the death she was given. The evidence against her was thin, manipulated, assembled with care to achieve a predetermined outcome. The charges of adultery, incest, and treason would not have withstood honest scrutiny. Henry had chosen to remove her, and the machinery of the state moved swiftly to fulfill his will. Like Icarus, Anne Boleyn flew too close to the sun. But the sun she approached was not ambition alone. It was the absolute and merciless power of Henry VIII, a power that granted everything and then consumed everything. And so she paid with her life, leaving behind a legacy both brilliant and painful, a name forever suspended between light and shadow, drifting slowly into the heavy sleep of history. Anne Boleyn lived in an age when every man and woman in England seemed to feel something intense about her. There were very few neutral hearts. To those who supported the reforming movement sweeping across Europe, Anne was like a sudden wind from another world, fresh, sharp, and illuminated with ideas that had not yet taken root in England. They saw in her a mind that cut through layers of tradition, a woman who dared to carry forbidden New Testament translations beneath her sleeves, who read them softly to the king, who believed that Scripture should be understood by ordinary people and not locked away in Latin. To these reformers, Anne was not simply a beautiful woman who had captured Henry VIII's attention. She was a rare intelligence, a force, someone who recognized the growing hunger for religious freedom and the power of knowledge in shaping the future. But to the larger portion of the English population, still deeply Catholic, still loyal to Catherine of Aragon, Anne was the opposite of all that admiration. She was a disturber of order, a breaker of sacred things, a woman whose arrival had torn the kingdom away from Rome and set England on a path no one had thought possible. They blamed her for the fall of Catherine, for the humiliation of Princess Mary, for the closing of monasteries, for every tremor that shook the kingdom. And in their fear and grief, they reached for old explanations. Superstition, rumor, whispers of witchcraft. Many believed them. Stories travelled through marketplaces and taverns with frightening ease that Anne had 6 fingers, that she carried a devil's mark, that she had bewitched the king with her dark eyes and French charm. There were women who turned away when she passed, so they would not be touched by her supposed misfortune. There were men who muttered that her beauty carried doom, that no good future could come from a queen so unlike the gentle Catherine. Even her elegance, shaped during her years in France, became a reason for suspicion. The English did not easily trust what felt foreign, and Anne, with her French manners and sharp wit, felt foreign in every way. Inside the court, opinion of Anne was just as divided, but far more dangerous. Some courtiers admired her brilliance, her quick mind, her skill in conversation, her ability to understand the complex weave of diplomacy and religious debate. But others bristled at her boldness. She was a woman who dared to speak directly to Henry VIII about politics, about appointments, about the direction of reform. She had opinions about ambassadors, bishops, royal finances, foreign alliances. She was not content to sit quietly and smile, she argued. She pushed, she insisted, and in a court ruled by fragile male pride, her confidence was often perceived as insolence. The truth was more complicated. Anne lived under pressures that would have broken almost anyone. She was expected to carry the weight of national policy on her shoulders, while also producing a son who would secure the future of the dynasty. She faced the constant hatred of those who saw her as an intruder, and the constant scrutiny of those who wanted her to fail. Every misstep, every sharp word, every emotional moment was magnified into an accusation. Her temper, sometimes quick and bright, flared more often under the relentless strain. Her tongue, naturally sharp, became a weapon she sometimes wielded too quickly. But beneath it all was a woman trapped between 2 sharpened expectations: deliver a prince or lose everything. And Henry's gaze, the one that had once adored her, changed with every disappointment. In the early years, he had been infatuated, charmed by her refusal to yield, her refusal to become his mistress, her fire. She made him feel young, victorious, chosen. She made him believe he could defy the Pope, the world, even time itself. But over the years, Henry's feelings shifted. First came pride in the woman he had fought so much to marry. Then came doubt, then came fear, then came resentment. Each lost pregnancy felt to him like a message from heaven, a divine rebuke for the path he had taken. In his mind, every misfortune became a sign that he had made the wrong choice. And Henry VIII was never gentle with those he believed had made him stumble before God. By the end, Anne was no longer the woman he had pursued for 7 long years. She had become, in his darkest thoughts, the embodiment of his errors, every disappointment, every failure, every blow to his confidence. The man who had once sworn that he would tear the world apart for her now saw her as a wound he wished desperately to close. And in the world of Henry VIII, the easiest way to close a wound was to cut it away. Although Anne's reign lasted only 3 years, her impact lingered far beyond the narrow window of time in which she wore the crown. Her influence soaked into the fabric of English culture, religion, and identity in ways that few queens before her, and very few after her, ever matched. Even as her name was later darkened by scandal and reshaped by enemies, the quiet currents she set into motion continued to ripple long after her death. Her legacy can be seen most clearly in 3 intertwined realms. First, the shaping of reformist faith. Anne was not merely a symbol of England's break with Rome. She was one of its earliest and most sincere internal voices. Her interest in the gentler strands of reform, the kind that emphasized scripture, conscience, and personal devotion, was not political performance. It came from genuine conviction. She read the New Testament in French, studied commentary, and pondered the writings of thinkers who were considered dangerous by the traditional church. The small library she kept lined with French translations of Scripture and the English New Testament by William Tyndale reveals a mind active, curious, and deeply spiritual. Through Henry VIII, Anne helped bring these ideas into the royal household. She pressed books into his hands, sometimes quietly, sometimes boldly. She urged him to consider that a king might hold authority over his own church, that faith did not have to be mediated by distant Rome. While Henry did not ultimately follow the exact reformist path she imagined, many historians agree that it was Anne who first nudged him toward the idea that England could shape its own religious destiny. Without her gentle persistence, the timeline of England's ecclesiastical independence might have looked very different. Second, her vision for the monasteries. When the dissolution of religious houses began under the direction of Thomas Cromwell, Anne's perspective stood in sharp contrast to his. Cromwell envisioned revenues, lands, and power flowing into the royal treasury. Anne envisioned something else: schools for children, shelters for the poor, institutions where learning and charity could flourish. She did not believe monasteries should remain untouched, but she believed their resources could be redirected with mercy and purpose rather than stripped away in a rush for gold. Though her influence did not prevail during her lifetime, these ideas did not vanish. Many scholars note that Anne's compassion, her desire for education, and her hope for a more literate and supported population resonated decades later through the policies of her daughter, Elizabeth I. In that way, Anne's quiet hope survived even when her voice had been silenced. Third, the transformation of courtly art and culture. Anne carried with her the refined elegance of the French courts where she had grown up. She brought that sensibility to England, reshaping fashion, language, courtly manners, and the visual style of the Tudor world. Under her patronage, Hans Holbein, the younger, one of the greatest artists of the 16th century, found a place in England. His portraits, with their calm faces, meticulous detail, and luminous realism, now define the Tudor era in the modern imagination. Anne's own emblem, the white falcon perched on a barren tree blossoming with Tudor roses, captured the blend of delicacy and strength that her supporters admired. It remains one of the most striking heraldic symbols of the age, a small work of art bearing a complex story. Elegance growing out of hardship, beauty emerging from desolation. Across these three realms, faith, charity, and culture, Anne's influence threaded its way quietly but powerfully through the decades. Even those who disliked her, who saw her only as the force that divided Henry VIII from Catherine of Aragon, could not deny that she changed the atmosphere of the English court. Her supporters saw an educated woman who dared to think differently. Her enemies saw a dangerous challenger to tradition. Both perspectives reveal something true. Anne disrupted the old order, and disruption always leaves marks. If Anne had never become queen, England might still have drifted from Rome. But what it would have lost is the unmistakable presence of a woman who spoke with conviction at a time when women were expected to remain silent. She modeled a kind of intellectual courage that was rare for her century. She believed ideas mattered. She believed scripture mattered. She believed charitable reform mattered. And these beliefs, though carried quietly, shaped the reign of her daughter and helped form the emerging identity of the English nation. Anne Boleyn died young, but her thoughts kept living, rising again in the policies of Elizabeth I, and echoing still in the long, winding story of a kingdom that learned, slowly, to stand apart from the religious power of continental Europe. Anne Boleyn, when lifted out of the familiar frame of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, becomes something far larger, far more intricate, far more unsettling than a footnote in a king's troubled marital history. She becomes one of the first women in early modern Europe who dared to negotiate her own position directly with a ruling monarch, not passively, not quietly, but with strategy, intelligence, and an unyielding sense of her own worth. At a time when women were expected to accept the paths chosen for them, Anne carved a path few would have believed possible, and she carved it with nothing but her mind, her voice, and her refusal to become anything less than the equal partner she envisioned herself to be. In an age when women were not permitted to speak publicly on matters of state, when they could not inherit great estates, when they were rarely educated beyond basic literacy, Anne wielded intellect like a finely sharpened blade. She understood diplomacy from her years in France. She understood scripture and the rising tide of religious reform. She understood the psychology of power, how desire could become influence, how attention could become leverage, how distance could turn curiosity into obsession, and she used every one of those insights when she refused Henry's offer to become his mistress. By declining that role, she did something extraordinary. She made the king negotiate with her. She made him wait. She made him question. She made him pursue. She forced him to imagine a different future, one in which she stood not beside his bed as a passing pleasure, but beside his throne as a crowned queen. It was radical. It was dangerous. It was, by the standards of her age, almost unthinkable. Many despised her for that ambition. They said ambition did not belong to women. They said cleverness in a woman was unfeminine, even threatening. They said Anne was unnatural because she wished for more than a quiet marriage and a silent life. And yet, centuries later, it becomes clear how deeply unfair such judgments were, not because Anne was perfect, but because ambition in a woman was treated as a crime long before the courts ever declared her guilty. In many ways, Anne became the symbol of the woman who flew too close to power. She did not creep toward influence in the shadows. She walked toward it in daylight, step by careful step. But power in Tudor England was not the warm sun one might hope for. It was a searing, burning star, and those who reached for it risked being consumed. Anne was consumed, but not erased. What remained of her was something more enduring, a legacy shaped not by compliance, but by defiance. Today, people often see her as several things at once: a woman whose intelligence outpaced the world she lived in, a political casualty in a court where alliances shifted like sand, a complicated figure whose sharp tongue and sharp mind made her both admired and feared, an early model of someone who demanded recognition of her worth, and a reminder that women in history are often reshaped, smoothed, sharpened, vilified, sanctified, depending entirely on who is telling the story. Perhaps the most striking thing about Anne is that she was never allowed to explain herself. She left no diary, no long memoir, no written defense. Nothing in her own voice that could anchor her image in the centuries that followed. Everything we know about her comes through others. Friends who adored her, enemies who hated her, ambassadors who mistrusted her, and historians who sift through the contradictions. Her identity, therefore, is less a portrait and more a mirror, reflecting the anxieties, desires, and values of each generation that retells her story. To Catholics of the 16th century, she was a temptress who broke a kingdom. To Protestants of the 17th, she was a martyr who helped deliver England from Rome. To Victorians, she was a tragic romantic heroine. To 20th century scholars, she was a political player caught in a lethal game. To many women today, she is something quieter but more powerful, a woman punished for wanting more than the world permitted her to have. Anne herself never claimed the role of feminist icon. She did not speak about equality. She did not write manifestos. She did not fight for abstract principles. All she ever fought for was the right to define her own life. But in a century when women were expected to be obedient, silent, and disposable, that fight alone was revolutionary. She asked for a marriage built on choice rather than surrender. She participated in the religious debates of her time. She refused to be a background figure in a story that affected her directly. She reached upward, not timidly, but boldly. And because of that, she lives far beyond her death, far beyond the politics that destroyed her, far beyond the cold stone floor that holds her remains. She lives as a reminder of a truth many eras preferred not to see, that a woman who demands a voice, even when she pays the highest price for it, cannot be forgotten. Elizabeth's story begins where Anne's seemed to end, forming a quiet but unmistakable answer to every accusation, every rumor, every cruel judgment that had once surrounded her mother. If history wished to paint Anne Boleyn as a mistake, destiny responded with a correction written in the brightest ink imaginable. The daughter once dismissed as a disappointment, born on the 7th day of September in the year 1533, became one of the greatest monarchs in all of Europe. In this way, Anne's life, which had closed in tragedy, opened again through her child. The mother fell into the darkest depth a queen could face, but the daughter rose to one of the highest peaks a ruler could reach. Few stories in history form such a perfect arc. Elizabeth I carried within her a dual inheritance that shaped her entire reign. From Anne came intelligence sharpened like a fine blade, a precise ear for languages, a gift for negotiation, and a deep instinct for reading people. From Henry VIII came willpower, unyielding, immovable, forged in fire. The combination made her a formidable sovereign. Under her rule, England entered what later generations would call the Golden Age, an era of astonishing artistic flowering, global exploration, and political strength. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in the year 1588 secured England's place among rising European powers. The English Church was stabilized under a carefully balanced policy that avoided extremes. Commerce expanded across oceans, and names like Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Spencer began to shimmer across the cultural sky. And yet, Elizabeth rarely spoke aloud of her mother. The silence was not born of shame, but of strategy. Anne's name remained politically sensitive. Open praise would invite hostility from Catholics, who still considered Anne the cause of England's separation from Rome. Instead, Elizabeth restored her mother's legacy in subtle, deliberate gestures. She reinstated lands and privileges to surviving Boleyn relatives. She preserved Anne's emblem, the white falcon crowned and standing upon a flowering branch. She surrounded herself with clerics who had once benefited from Anne's protection. Through quiet actions rather than public statements, she rewrote the ending that had once been forced upon her mother. Within Elizabeth's style of rule, one can sense Anne's presence, like a faint but persistent shadow, always near. Elizabeth's remarkable emotional restraint, her talent for remaining composed under pressure, her ability to pause before speaking, her usage of symbolism, and her instinct for balancing different religious factions all reflect traits that had existed in Anne, though history did not allow Anne the time or safety to develop them fully. Where Anne had been punished for speaking her mind, Elizabeth learned when to speak and when to remain silent. Where Anne had sought influence through debate, Elizabeth mastered influence through control. Where Anne had attempted to negotiate with a king for her own future, Elizabeth became the king, or rather, the queen, who negotiated directly with nations. Perhaps most striking is Elizabeth's insistence on self-definition. When Parliament pressured her to marry, she famously replied that she was already bound to a husband, namely, the Kingdom of England. In those words lies an echo of Anne's earliest insistence that she would not be merely a mistress, that she would determine her own value. Elizabeth turned the struggle her mother had endured into a principle of reign. No one would decide her future but herself. The voice that had been silenced at the Tower spoke again in the voice of a queen who ruled for more than 4 decades. This leads to the question historians and storytellers often ask: did Anne Boleyn fail? If one looks only at her life, the answer seems painfully clear. She lost everything: her status, her power, her reputation, her family, her liberty, and finally her life. She walked to her death under a sky that did not yet know her story was not over. But if one views her legacy through the lens of Elizabeth's reign, the answer shifts. Anne did not fail. She changed the trajectory of a kingdom. She shaped a daughter who would reshape the world. Through Elizabeth, Anne's beliefs about education, conscience, and intellect found room to live. Through Elizabeth, Anne's bloodline sat not simply upon a throne, but upon a throne that guided England into a new era. Through Elizabeth, Anne's story, once buried beneath accusation and fear, rose again, not vindicated in words, but vindicated in achievement. Anne Boleyn may have lost the battle for her own life, but she won the battle for her legacy. Her daughter became the answer that time eventually offered, a queen of extraordinary brilliance, strength, and endurance. And in the long quiet of history, as centuries settled like dust over the Tower stones, the story of mother and daughter formed a single truth: that greatness sometimes blooms from the very ground where injustice once tried to bury it. Anne Boleyn's story resists every attempt to compress it into a single, tidy verdict. It slips out of categories the way light slips through the cracks of an old stone wall, uncontainable, shifting, always more than it first appears. Was she good or bad? Ambitious or victimized? A destroyer of worlds or a catalyst for renewal? Anne was all of these things, and none of them entirely. She was a human being, contradictory, vivid, fallible, brilliant, alive in a world that preferred women to be quiet shadows rather than blazing torches. She loved fiercely and hated fiercely. She hoped like someone who had been raised to believe in possibility, and she feared like someone who understood how quickly possibility could turn to danger. She was confident, then suddenly shaken, sharp-tongued and clever one moment, vulnerable the next, compassionate in her reforms, yet sometimes cutting in her personal judgments. She carried both the tenderness of a young woman raised among books and music, and the hardened instinct of someone who had learned that court life was played with knives, not ribbons. It is this mixture, this restless blend of grace and steel, that has kept her name alive for nearly 500 years, long after hundreds of other Tudor ladies have faded into the quiet pages of history. Anne did not deserve the fate handed to her. Not the charges spun out of thin air, not the trial twisted into a performance, not the scaffold raised too quickly for the truth to catch up. She did not deserve the cold air of that May morning, the sword hidden under straw, the hurried burial without a stone to mark her name. But the world she lived in was not built on fairness. It was built on power. And in that world, Anne chose to live fully, even recklessly, rather than shrink herself into safety. She insisted on shaping her own path, insisted on being more than a mistress, more than an ornament, more than a silent figure behind a king. She reached toward influence with both hands, and for a moment, she held it. Her death reveals the cruelty of absolute monarchy, the danger of standing too close to the fire of a king's desire, and the terrifying speed at which a crown can turn to dust. Yet her life reveals something else, too, the resilience of truth. For even though Anne was buried without ceremony, even though her enemies smeared her name, even though Henry VIII tried to erase her from memory, the truth of who she was has gradually risen back into the light piece by piece, century by century. Myths have fallen away, lies have been challenged, and beneath them all, a complex, flawed, powerful woman emerges, still breathing through the words left behind by ambassadors, chroniclers, and the child she never lived to see grow into a queen. Today, Anne Boleyn is no longer simply the second wife of Henry VIII. She is a symbol of the uncomfortable truths hidden inside every story of power. She reminds us how dangerous it is for a woman to want too much in a world built to deny her. She reminds us how ambition becomes a crime when it belongs to the wrong person in the wrong century. She reminds us how political forces can twist a life into a cautionary tale, and how those tales can be rewritten by time. She is also a symbol of strength, of a woman who refused to let others define her worth. She is a reminder that brilliance can be punished, but not extinguished. She is a warning and an inspiration in equal measure. A reminder that sometimes the greatest tragedies belong to those who dared to live ahead of their age. What Anne left behind, her influence on religious reform, her enrichment of courtly culture, her insistence on education and conscience, and most of all her daughter, Elizabeth I, ensures that her shadow stretches far beyond her short life. She flew too near the sun, yes, but the light she cast has never faded. And if the sun burned her, it also illuminated her, revealing a woman whose story refuses to die, whose voice still echoes softly across the centuries, and whose legacy still glows in the long twilight of Tudor history.